Yeah. Yeah.
This is the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Byron Pace, and you're listening to a very special limited series of 6 episodes called the Conservation Roundtable, where we take a deep dive into conservation news from around the world. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Modern Huntsman. I am the conservation editor on that publication, and you can read more on www.modernhuntsman.com. And welcome, everybody, to episode 2 of this series of 6, where I have the privilege of sitting down with Jess and Ford to bring you fascinating stories from around the world. Jess, Ford, give us our 2-second intro for who you are, just in case people forgot from a week ago.
Oh, I'm Jess Johnson. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Wyoming Wildlife Federation, 2% board member, and a co-founder of Artemis Sportswomen.
Boom. Done.
I am Ford Van Fossen. I am the content and conservation manager at First Lite Performance Hunting Apparel, and basically that means I handle our company's interactions with nonprofits, with our own outreach and advocacy programs, and with fundraising for nonprofits.
Great. And I think since Jess had to go first last week, Ford, let's start with you. What story are you bringing to the table today?
Well, we're talking different levels here. On the surface, we're talking wolf management in Idaho.
Whoa!
Which is
talk about heavy.
Yeah, dropping bombs proverbially within our world, within our industry. But I'm okay talking about it because I actually think that in many regards, this isn't about wolves, or what is most important about this story is not actually how Idahoans manage their wolves, but what these changes represent. And to step back, basically what's happened is the legislature of Idaho has put together legislation, as they do, that basically compels our Fish and Game Commission to manage wolves in a specific way. What that actually entails is extremely controversial. It essentially it's quite complicated, but the short form is it would allow Idaho to remove up to 90% of its wolves.
I saw this on social like in the last 2 weeks.
Oh yeah,
yeah. But I never had the time to like dig into. Because Jess and I've done this before. It's like, okay, here's the headlines that were created to grab everyone's attention, which
Absolutely.
is probably only, well, I'm going to use their numbers, probably only 90% of the truth of what's really happening underneath. So I'm intrigued to find out what's going on here, Ford.
Very much so, yeah. So essentially liberalizes hunting and trapping further, even though we already basically hunt wolves year round in Idaho in most places and trap them very heavily. But again, that the content here, the substance is extremely controversial. However, really what I think is most significant is that we have the legislature of Idaho. We have people, elected to represent the citizens of Idaho, making decisions about how we manage our wildlife, right? Directly telling Fish and Game, the wildlife management professionals who we've entrusted with the public's trust or the public's wildlife, essentially. And to jump in upon my own opinions here, I think that's extremely problematic. And again, it's not really even necessarily about how we're managing wolves right now. It's about a precedent that's set where we are managing our wildlife by democratic means, right? Which sounds optimistic, but I think is problematic. And
yeah, I mean, the flip side is when it goes the other way, like Colorado's ballot initiative.
Exactly. Yes. And that was sort of the second article I tacked on, was just a reference on what's gone on in Colorado, where we have a ballot initiative that has been narrowly passed, compelling CPW. I believe that's the correct acronym, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, I think.
Yep, CPW.
To reintroduce wolves amidst, certainly controversy, but also amidst a documented wolf pack reestablishing or establishing itself in the northwestern part of the state.
You wouldn't have believed the uproar in Wyoming ag and Wyoming hunters when that passed, and how, well, we're going to be dealing with Colorado wolves coming to Wyoming because nobody wants to be in Colorado anyways, including wolves.
That's hilarious.
It was a very interesting, it's both sides, and it's interesting to be in Wyoming in between these two states. One that's, Idaho and Montana and Colorado have had some major moves in the last 2 years politically around wolves, and I think, in more to Ford's point, around who's making these professional wildlife decisions. And what I can tell you is not the professionals that are making them, which is a problem. And I'm fully on Ford's same page with having an issue with it. Not that Wyoming's done much better. We have a really interesting wolf management scenario here anyways. So
it's a really important point to raise. And we deal with this all the time. We like to think that decisions around wildlife management can and should be made just based on science, and by science, I mean, with the best information at hand, we are trying to work out what the truth is. It's truth searching for the facts to try and understand what is the best management for this area. But you cannot disentangle wildlife management from people. And so there is always going to be politics involved. There was always going to be a sort of a social ecology related to conservation. And to think that we can just deal with one and not the other is so naive, because we've seen it happen time and time again. And so we have to understand that any conservation management decisions need to consider the views and opinions and emotions of people, because, as you pointed out, that can often actually drive management decisions beyond what necessarily the science suggests should be the management decision.
Oh yeah,
I think there's a balance that needs to be struck, and we faced this with elk feed grounds this year in Wyoming, where our legislature removed the authority of the Game and Fish to manage feed grounds or close them as is needed, and handed it to the governor. So rather than our Game and Fish Commission, which is informed by obviously our wildlife professionals, it's put in the governor's hand. The one thing I will say, and maybe I've wrestled a lot with how I felt about all of this, is that the thing is that we, rather than working on the process, the public process that all game and fish state, in the states, all game and fish agencies. So, in America, wildlife is owned by the states. So each state's wildlife agency is the one sort of dealing with management plans, obviously aside from the fact of federally listed things like grizzly bears and whatnot. But, looking at state wildlife management plans and how those are set, rather than focusing on the public engagement and the education of people to engage in the processes that already exist, that have ample public comment and ample outreach to more stakeholders than just hunters and anglers. Agriculture has always been at the table in Wyoming and in many other states when these wildlife decisions are made. So rather than focusing on the public process that many of our state agencies have gone through, we're just wrestling all of the authority to deal with this away from them, telling them to do something that may or may not be aligned with science, and putting it in the hands of people that are susceptible to political swings in administration or other things like that. And so it's taking a process that could be very equitable and could be better, always could be better, but we're throwing this process totally out the window and just putting it, sort of shackling it to this pendulum swing of administration change and public sentiment, which, as we know, is can be incendiary.
Yeah. And that, not to harp back down to the specifics in Idaho, but basically this bill was introduced, passed, and placed on the governor's desk in about a week. So if when it comes to feedback, that was non-existent, right? I mean, this was just fast-tracked, which is, not really related to this greater theme of legislative management of wildlife, but was extremely problematic in my view.
Oh yeah, it's when it's greased, it would take a really well organized, concerted effort to stop it. And I work for hunting organizations, and I can tell you I've yet to see one that can stop a piece of legislation moving that fast.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we were all sort of blindsided, I think. Sort of what, and by the time we had figured out what was going on, it had passed the Senate and the House.
Yeah, it's a dangerous precedent. I mean, what
it is?
I mean, what are the longer term implications here? I mean, what could be the roll on effect of this?
Absolutely. Well, and I think an irony here is perhaps that, in Idaho, for example, I think the same folks that are advocating for an extremely aggressive wolf management policy would be rather upset if in 20 years an additional 1 million folks have moved here from California, which is probably not out of the realm of possibility.
Not out of the realm, no.
No, and those people don't like bear hunting. And they introduced a ballot initiative that eliminates bear hunting in Idaho. I just tend to think the same people that just fast-tracked this wolf management legislation would be rather upset by the same policy being pushed through from a different side of the world.
Yeah, everybody hates the bureaucracy of democracy until it works for them and slows it down enough for all voices to be heard. It's the same thing with, you can broaden that out into like multiple use of like how we manage our public lands. Everybody's got a problem with it until it's a decision is made that they don't like, and then all of a sudden they have ample time to weigh in on.
Yeah, it's dangerous, and really that actually isn't theoretical. It's theoretical in the sense of Idaho, but other states nearby, for example, Washington, have banned bear hunting with hounds in recent memory, basically due to gut reactions to a couple exposés of the practice. And so it is certainly dangerous ground we tread here in Idaho, I think, with this move recently. And that's not to say, of course, this is novel or has never happened in the state or the West before, but it's not an encouraging trend.
It's happening more and more, is what my gut
around
says,
the world.
Yeah,
around the world. I mean, we saw it with the bear hunting ban in BC a couple of years ago as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, where they polled like 900 people.
Yeah.
Jess, I was going to pull up your story to like intro it for you to talk about, and weirdly, I click on it and it says unavailable due to legal reasons. We are recognizing that you're attempting to access this website from a country belonging to the European Economic Area. I'm not anymore because I'm in the UK, so we're not in Europe, including the EU, which enforces general data protection regulations. So I have no idea what you're about to talk about, but go for it.
I like it. Started off with a false GDPR warning.
Yep.
I always have an air of mystery. This one is one I've been hearing and seeing a lot, especially because it's relatively recent. But I picked this article specifically because of the tone of it, and it's called the tagline is this. Representative Simpson calls on his challengers to provide alternatives. So the background here is that a Idaho congressman has put together a package that is, I think it's like a $33 billion package that is calling for all of the dams to be breached and for huge investments to be made to replace lost hydropower generation, shore up the financially challenged Bonneville Power Administration, help farmers get their grains to overseas market via trains instead of their barges that they usually do, and then to aid communities and adjusting to life without slack water. So the push behind this is the Snake River salmon and steelhead, and the just epically massive decline that we've seen, and these removal of these dams, is been presented as a way to help bring this population back. And I picked this one because I think this is, Ford's likely been hearing a lot about this, and I was curious what he had to say around it as well.
Oh yeah, we're hitting all of the most controversial topics in Idaho.
That's amazing. And what a perfect tie-in. Perfect time, because I'm also going to be talking about salmon.
Which is why I picked this story. So I thought this was really interesting. Go for it.
Have you guys seen Damnation? I haven't seen it, but this is reminding me what you're telling me now. That was about removal. That was a Patagonia film, was it?
Yes.
Yep. And that really was basically was talking about the same dynamic that Jess is referring to right now.
Yeah. So the thing that I thought, and the reason I picked this instance, is because obviously, clearly, this is incredibly controversial, especially going up against hydropower plants and agriculture, and wrestling with all of the infrastructure that we've built, and then pulling that out and having to find, how we make this better, while also having, salmon and steelhead in our lives, which is an equally large and huge, not just conservation provider, but economic provider, when you look at it in whether it's the fishing or in guide trips and tourism and everything that's around that. The thing that I found interesting is that his pushback to this, when he is working with people that disagree with him, is not so much that they are wrong, but that they need to provide an alternative, because we're at a standing point where salmon and steelhead, they need help and they are still declining. We have not figured out what else to do except for this. And so he's going, well, if it's not this, what else can we do? So rather than just opposing something, oppose it, but bring a solution. And I thought that was a really, really great.
It's a great message.
It's a great message. It's a great narrative. It's something that we don't often see in politics, especially in America right now. We initially just go and immediate pushback, no, we can't do that, rather than being we can't do that here, but maybe we can do this here. And it's the art of compromise, the art of the alternative, and things like that. So I was really been interested in following all of this story around this. It is a massive thing to try and conceptualize.
It's a huge
breaching
deal.
These dams. Huge.
Yeah, it's huge.
Not just huge in project wise, but huge in money, huge
politically.
Politically, huge in changing economics. It's a major super thing. But the fact that we're having these discussions, and that we have people that are willing to at least bring this discussion to the table, whether it's feasible or not, I think is hopeful. And that we're having dialogue around it, rather than just blatant absolutely not.
Yeah, it's strange, because where you look at a place like North America, where the dam debate, and we're seeing it in Europe as well, looking at the damage that building a lot of these dams has done to the pathways, particularly of migratory fish. But it's not just that. It's about how that affects flow downstream, how that affects the transportation of sedimentation downstream, and what are the roll-on impacts of that. Some for farming, historic farming, some for just how it fertilizes these natural landscapes. And yet, on the other hand, you look at places like China, which are building a crazy number of dams every year, and we look at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which I think is going to be the biggest. Let me look it up. I think it's going to be the biggest dam in Africa. It's going to be 1,800 meters long and 155 meters high. And that is massively controversial, because obviously it's being put in to supply water for people and to supply water for agriculture and drinking water. But the downstream impact of that is going to be huge. And actually, it's going to be huge politically as well, because of how it changes this flow pattern of water. And I think it's fascinating to think about how we could be undoing some of this.
Yeah.
And I think it's also interesting to... Sorry, Karen, Jess.
I was just saying, it's one of those things where it feels like some of the discussion, and I don't know that I've necessarily heard it portrayed as this, but when I look at it, is this is getting ahead of the ball rather than being behind it, rather than being crap, they're extinct, being oh boy, how do we save ourselves
before we
get too far. And maybe this is the right answer, maybe it's not. I do think one, it's really interesting that it is a Republican who is introducing this, not a Democrat. And it's not often you see that sort of dichotomy in our politics here. I thought that was really great. But it's been interesting. The level of pushback has been massive. So it's been a dialogue that's probably been needing to happen, but it'll be interesting where it finally lands.
What do you reckon, Ford? Do you think this is going to be something that we see like increasingly rolled out, or a discussion that we see increasingly happen around the world where dams have really negatively affected our biodiversity and the ability for species to survive? I wonder, though, just as you're thinking about answering that, clearly these dams were built for a reason, and normally they were built because we needed them for development. So how does that water source get replaced, or the power for that matter, at a time when we're trying to get renewables up and running? I mean, hydro is probably one of the oldest renewables we've ever used.
Yeah, and results in the Northwest, being fairly light, right, in the carbon pollution department, because we do have so much hydropower. But those are, I mean, basically Simpson's, I think, answer would be, if I may go out on a limb, would be that's what the $35 to $40 billion he wants is for, right? Is essentially replacing that power, replacing, I think actually in this case, more importantly, that transportation infrastructure, right? Oddly enough, Lewiston, Idaho is a seaport, if that makes sense. Because of these dams, because of all the dams, but the dams in question are the what's called the lower four dams on the basically the upper reaches of the Columbia River.
Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, Little Goose, and Lower Granite dams.
Exactly, yeah, and a lot of what they do is allow farmers in that region, in Idaho, in Oregon, et cetera, to move grain crops efficiently up and down that river system.
Oh, fascinating. Wow. So it's a transport route as well as a water provision.
Yeah.
Oh, big time. Yeah, and then I think that would, I don't know this, but I think experts, or those closer to this, would say that is a bigger factor even than the power generation in this circumstance.
Yeah, and this article makes a big point about helping farmers get their grains to overseas markets. He offers trains and infrastructure on that sort of sense instead of barges. It's just interesting because you're removing this hydropower, and if we're figuring out other transportation, you also have to think about other impacts to wildlife. And I don't know the areas as well, but when you introduce trains and roads and trucking, you up
they have an impact too.
Wildlife collisions and fragmentation of habitat. So it's really one of those things of like balancing, like the balancing act that we're charged with figuring out how to make this work.
It makes me think of we have, and I was just there the other day. In fact, I'm going to part of a project on the Loch Ness system I'm going to talk about for my story. But we have a Caledonian that's called the Caledonian Canal. It's a canal that cuts the east coast to the west coast of Scotland from Loch Ness, sort of diagonally down across the country, like along the Highland Fault. And that canal, it seems, is one of the biggest reasons for losses of young salmon trying to go to sea. In fact, I was speaking to the head biologist of the system just last week, and he was saying that because the river system and the waterways were never connected to the west until man intervened, what happens is as the smolts are going down the river, some of them go to the wrong coast. Whereas they should be going down the rivers and heading out to the east coast. Some of them are going along the canal and then going west. And then the other problem is when they're in the canal, this is a really slow body of water. So they're just completely open to predation. Whereas normally they'd be in fairly fast flowing rivers being carried at this time of year. We're getting pretty much to the end of the smolt run now, and out to sea, pretty quickly within the space of a couple of weeks. But in the canal, they're under their own steam. Whereas normally they would just basically let the current take them out to sea, and they just get all picked off, and they're losing and it seems like almost entirely because of the canal, they're losing 91% of all of their salmon smolts before they even hit the ocean.
Wow.
And a lot of that has to do with the canal. And then to your point about transportation, how do you fix that problem? They're never going to close the Caledonian Canal. It's the only thing that connects the east to the west in terms of waterways. Otherwise, what do? I mean, there's no road there is a road that does it, but it kind of sucks. And otherwise, you take a boat, I don't know, all the way around the north of Scotland.
Yeah, it's pretty tough, and there's no easy answer if you're a grain farmer in this circumstance in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, or western Idaho. It's not attractive, it's not attractive at all, and I see it both ways. But I think Simpson has been eloquent about sort of the argument for dam removal, and to paraphrase it, it goes something along the lines of, do we know that removing these dams will will bring the salmon back? And his answer is, frankly, no. We're not 100% sure this will fix the problem, but are we comfortable with our grandchildren asking, why do we call this the Salmon River?
It's a great point. And what we do know is that the current status quo doesn't work. Not for species survival. That we know for a fact.
Exactly. And I think his branding around this plan has been effective that way. It's sort of, well, we don't know this, we do know this, we know it's not working. We know everything we've done. We know the billions of dollars we've spent in the Pacific Northwest to bring back the Columbia salmon hasn't worked. And to not try this is to, I think, in his view at least, accept the extinction of salmon in the upper reaches of the Columbian and the Snake specifically.
I really like that this has been raising that conversation to a national level here, in the sense of like being like, it's setting a dialogue using the example of the salmon, but also setting this up for like a bigger platform to start talking about how we handle conservation, and do we handle it in a way that's like very knee-jerk and reactionary after it's too late to really do much and we have to struggle a lot and try and bring them back and put them on endangered species lists, or do we handle it in ways that are like with forethought and ahead of the ball, and looking at the sage grouse story is the same thing. It's yet to be listed because of a Herculean effort of work to keep them off the list.
Keep it off.
I think this is a similar thinking in saying like, why don't, it's cheaper, frankly, the economic argument is it's cheaper to fix the problem before it's a extinction problem.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and talking about human intervention, it leads me into my story, which is, like I said, also about salmon. There was a study published in, let me get the journal right, Proceedings of the Royal Society of Biological Sciences, that was looking at the title of the paper is A Century of Genetic Homogenization in Baltic Salmon, Evidence from Archival DNA. And basically what they did was they had these 13 rivers in Sweden that they had scale samples from rivers, and they from the 1920s. And they looked at the genetic differences of salmon populations between these 13 rivers. And then they looked at them much more recently. And they found that there is more similarities between the populations of these 13 rivers today than there actually are differences. And the reason for that is because, and I know that this has been a problem, in fact, it was a subject of another Patagonia film called Artificial, which looked at this rearing of salmon, and I'm not even talking about fish farms, and I'll tackle that in a second, but the rearing of salmon and stocking of our rivers artificially to keep salmon stocks high. And by having this human intervention in stocking the rivers, we've messed with the natural flow of genetic selection. And as a result of that, we've got this homogenization of populations between rivers. And you can ask yourself the question, well, kind of what's the problem with that? Well, there's two major problems. One is the science has proven that they are genetically inferior. They are not able to withstand the same kind of spectrum of stresses that the normal natural selection would facilitate. And secondly, as we're looking at things like pollution and particularly climate change, this greater divergence in genetics between populations is what gives us the greatest possibility for adaptations to occur to these environmental changes. So if you've got a population which is all very genetically similar, they might succumb to the same problem. For example, there's the bacteria that has been, and I can't remember the pathogen's name, that kills a lot of amphibians that was, I think, imported from Asia. Killed a lot of amphibians in South America. They have found that some of the species that have survived, the death rate is insane. I think it kills something crazy like 98%. CB is what it's shortened to. Citrid fungus, that's it. Some of the species, some small proportions of the species population survive, and it's just because of very minor genetic differences. And so we've got this situation where we've created genetically inferior species, and each river is now basically the same population. And we see this also played out with fish farms, where you have massive escapes from fish farms here around the coast of Scotland. The salmon that are in fish farms are not native to our rivers here in Scotland. Most of the breed stock from salmon farms comes from larger, faster growing fish found in Scandinavian rivers. And so here and over in Ireland, we have this influx of escaped salmon farmed fish running into our rivers and breeding with our native fish.
This seems like such a aha moment, in the sense of like we do this over and over and over again in humanity and in science.
Thinking we're doing a good thing.
By being like, oh yeah, we'll fix this by doing this, and here's the easiest way to do it, and we just do it this way, rather than like,
has it ever worked?
Yeah,
I'm thinking like cane toads in America,
or mongoose in Hawaii.
Yes.
Like, oh, let's just do this. And you're like, oh, wow, nature's way more complex. And, meanwhile,
way smarter than we are.
Call ourselves scientists and stewards and managers. And meanwhile, we're clueless.
We're screwing it up is what we end up doing very often. But it's like it's the unseen attack on the survival of species around the world is genetic diversity.
Oh yeah.
And this is just one example in salmon where we have really had a hand in creating this problem. But we see the same thing to your point, Jess, like you were talking about earlier, trying to solve a problem before it's like on the brink of being too late. Because if you let these populations go down to very small numbers, like we were talking about with bison last week, you can end up with these genetic bottlenecks, which you can never really fix, and they become far more vulnerable to environmental change.
Yeah, if we don't ferret comes to mind that way right now.
Exactly.
In terms of recent news, to the point where we are trying to resurrect one single ferret, because I believe, wasn't basically didn't have the carcass in a freezer essentially, and she had never reproduced successfully, and so they went to the length of cloning her specifically to introduce just one more piece of new genetic information into this tiny, tiny population. What's her name? I'm trying to remember.
I'm Googling it right now.
Is it Elizabeth? It went around my friend group.
The black-footed ferret. I love it.
Oh,
it's something. It is something rather human, I feel. Yeah.
But it is like it's just
pretty
that
wild
thing of making it like we're consistently learning, and that's great. And, science and studies and everything that's coming out of it. But I keep going back to this thought of like, we're so arrogant to think that we can manipulate all of this and it's all going to be fine, rather than like taking some like lessons, whether it's from indigenous folk or it's lessons from whoever, looking at the landscape and letting it tell us a little better what it needs, rather than us mandating what is needed there.
Yeah.
And it just
Elizabeth you're so
Ann,
right, Jess.
By the way,
Elizabeth Ann.
Okay, so that is 100% why it is Elizabeth, because both
but she
Jess
was
knows
cloned.
both of these humans.
Yeah, she was cloned from the tissue of a ferret named Willa.
Right. And so my fiance's name is Elizabeth Ann, and my best friend Annie, also, her name is Ann Elizabeth. And that is why it's circulated amongst our friends.
Got it.
In retrospect, that's why that's all coming back together.
Well, I will end this as a reinforcement of your point, Jess, by reading a quote from the article that I actually pulled this story from. Well, it was the article like based on the original paper, and it was a quote from Carlos Garcia, who's the director for the Center for Sustainable Aquatic Research at Swansea University here in the UK. And he said that it is another nail in the coffin of stocking. And he refers to the techno-arrogance approach to salmon conservation, one that simply addresses the symptoms, fewer fish, and not the causes, which is less water, less habitat, more fragmented rivers, simply by releasing more fish into the system. And we have this debate here all the time, and I'm going to keep this very brief because this could be an entire podcast, about introducing hatcheries into our rivers. And there's a very simple way to understand this. The biologists on the rivers who are doing surveys know what the stocking densities of young juvenile fish are. Like, what is the carrying capacity? Everything pretty much has a carrying capacity. What is the carrying capacity of our rivers? And we have a fairly good handle on this through electrofishing. And we know in many instances, our rivers, despite declining populations of salmon running into the rivers from the ocean, they're still able to populate the rivers to a point where they're pretty much at maximum carrying capacity for juvenile fish. The problem is that we're losing all of these fish at some point between them making their way down the river and then getting out to the ocean before they can come back. That is what has changed. So if you put a hatchery on a river and you put more juvenile fish into it, what are you really achieving? There's only a set density that river can sustain. So you're either providing food for other predators or you're creating more competition and or, as this article proves, just reducing the resilience of the genetic pool. So we really have to be careful. And with that doom and gloom, we've got a sound. We've got a sound and to end this show with, and I'm gonna pull up a sound for you guys. So, are you ready?
As ready as we'll be.
So it's not the loud bird; it's like the croaky sound.
It's the knocking sound.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's not the stuff that's obviously bird sound.
Is it amphibian?
No.
The knocking sound.
No guesses?
I'm like thinking, is it a bird?
Let me put it this way, right? Yes, it is a bird. And you have a kind of an equally charismatic bird in the US. It looks very different, but I would say equally
have
charismatic.
A guess. I feel good about a guess.
Go for it, Ford.
Capercaillie.
Well done.
Oh, that was good.
You got it. You got it. Cool. Well, once again, it's been a pleasure, guys.
Yeah.
Until next time.
Oh, it's been lovely.
Absolutely.